Alrighty. It is October 2nd, and we are trying to get some league play in before the next GP. I have a lot on my plate, so I'm not sure how much of the league I can actually really get in. I'm going to try my best to try and get at least one or two leagues down before I start thinking about what I'm going to be playing for the GP. I know I'm really looking at sustainable investments, and I've talked about like really sort of having my eye on sustainable investments, specifically something in the sort of black, green, blue range. But for now, I really wanted to try seeing if the Protoclass Behemoth rework, the nerf to increase its cost from 9 to 12, couldn't be made into an upside. Specifically, and I mentioned this during my review of the changes, I had my eyes on Protoclass Behemoth alongside Tide's Ire. A pretty simplistic 2-mana enchantment. Whenever you cast a creature spell, you put X depth counters on Tide's Ire, where X is that spell's mana value. You can remove 10 depth counters from Tide's Ire to make an 8/8 blue Kraken creature token, or 30 to make a legendary 2020 Trimokratus Kraken creature token with trample and hexproof. So the theory here is that if you can get 9 cards your opponent owns into exile, uh, then Tide's Ire, alongside Protoclast Behemoth, allows you to put a 3-mana 9/6 in play with trample and a very backbreaking ward cost, alongside making an 8/8 Kraken. And the hope is that that is going to be enough pressure to start really laying into the opponent quick. Getting some benefit out of the fact that Tide's Ire and the tokens it makes are no longer quite so vulnerable, with work safety violation no longer shooting things with a total mana value of 4 or less. Um, so that was the basic goal, was Protoclass Behemoth plus Tide's Ire. I started messing around with Chittering Gargantua lists to see if like there's a way to sort of fold that in, because Gargantua costing base mana value of 10 also allows it to come in with an 8/8 blue Kraken. And the more I sort of tinkered with that deck idea, the more I realized that Gargantua and Behemoth are kind of inherently at odds with each other. I'd messed around with basic list ideas for a sort of Grixis Gargantua list last month before the card adjustments hit, where you were using Gargantua and Behemoth alongside each other, and you were trying to use Garen to sacrifice your Gargantua to flip into a Protoclass Behemoth, exile one of your opponent's creatures, and then get a tapped 9/6 with Trample. However, that deck kind of had similar issues of Protoclass Behemoth and Gargantua actively ask you to do very different things and need you to be doing it very aggressively in order for them to be reasonably costed. Reasonably in terms of how much you're willing to spend for them, not necessarily what's reasonable for the card you're getting. With that in mind, I kind of had to make my choice of, did I think Tide's Ire would work better with Chittering Gargantua, a card which has had some of its best supporting pieces adjusted or full on reworked this recent patch, or Protoclass Behemoth, who, did have some supporting cards reworked this patch. Black colorless integrate is going to have to look to win games in more complicated ways than with Tithe to the Machine now. Um, but I think the Protoclass Behemoth version of this list is going to look a lot better. We have a few different ways to pick apart what our opponent has going on and sort of get cards into exile. So a lot of what this deck ends up doing is looking to try and play some decently statted creatures, maybe a little understatted, but with the intention to be able to try and lock down the board, hold the board state, while also getting opponent's cards into exile and trying to generate some value in the process. So we have a total of 18 creatures here. 3 play sets and 2 3-ofs. So obviously we've got a playset of the Protoclass Behemoth. Again, 12 mana 9/6, costs 1 less to cast for each card in exile you don't own. So if we can get this ball rolling here, we can cast this for as little as 3 colorless or 3 black or somewhere in between. For a 9/6 that like just snipes a creature that our opponent controls, sends it directly to exile, and then if our opponent wants to remove this, now they have to exile a non-land, non-token permanent they control, which puts another card in exile. Which, so if we cast our Protoclast Behemoth for 5, and then we exile one of our opponent's creatures, and they try to target our Protoclast Behemoth with removal, our next Behemoth is almost certainly going to cost 3, which is pretty nice. But even just on top of that, Behemoth is just removal on a stick, and a stick that very rapidly kills our opponent, even without Tide's Ire. We also have, starting down at the bottom of our curve, Lurking Virkolakis. Very simple, very, very rudimentary card. You know, we've seen this on this channel before. Virkolakis can very quickly take over games. It's going to be a little harder for it to scale on our own cards, just on the virtue of, you know, we aren't a turbo graveyard deck. We're not filling our own graveyard as quickly, so this isn't going to be as consistent targeting ourselves. But whenever we do find a card in our own graveyard, there is no reason we want to keep it in our graveyard unless it's Chronicle of Extinction. So Lurking Virkolakis will be able to much more safely target us if we really want to guarantee the counter. Our other 3-of, up at the 3-drop slot, is Data Weaver. Data Weaver is a card that definitely showed off how good it was at the GP, was in the runner-up deck list running by Split Moon, was a black colorless integrate deck. Just 3-mana, 2/3, steal the top 2 cards of your opponent's library, and you can play cards that you have integrated onto permanents you control, spend mana or mana of any type. Really does help you sort of catch up to your opponent, or sort of overtake your opponent in terms of card advantage. It is a sort of like innocuous body, but it is something that really demands your opponent deal with it, because you will just get to kind of spiral out of control, especially if you have other ways of integrating. This deck doesn't have too many. You know, we have the Data Weavers. So if we, you know, data weave multiple times, and our like first one gets killed, our second one opens up the ability to play ones that we had previously. But otherwise, we only have a single Mirror Meld Spire in the land base, just as sort of like a way to spend a bit of colorless mana as needed, and also just sort of another land that can cast the Protoclast Behemoth if needed. But otherwise, you know, we're not really like super deep onto the integrate plan. So how are we getting cards into our opponent's exile? Well, we have 3 copies of Callisto the Techiarch. Pretty solid stat line for the cost. 3-mana, 2/4 Human Wizard. Beginning of your upkeep, exile a top card of target opponent's library. You may play that card for as long as it remains exiled, and mana of any type can be spent to cast it. On top of that, spells you cast and don't own cost 1 less to cast. This is going to work incredibly in conjunction with something like Data Weaver, as well as with another card we have that is going to be stealing cards that our opponent has, and obviously works well with its own upkeep ability as well, and starts to escalate how quickly we can get Protoclast Behemoth in play. We also have Inner Ring's Pupil as sort of our top end in theory, though it's likely we may be casting Protoclast Behemoths above the Inner Ring's Pupil. This was sort of just trying to find a good 4-drop to sort of top off the curve. Good creature with like a relevant enters trigger that can sort of apply pressure to our opponent. One of the things I'm really invested in doing with this deck is trying to grind the opponent out of resources as quickly as possible. And you know, we can do that by, you know, like stealing cards from the top of our opponent's library, but we can also do that by you know, shredding our opponent's hand. And Inner Ring's Pupil is a really good way to do that, both because it does so on enters and attacks. If our opponent's hand is empty, it forces them to sacrifice, and if they can't sacrifice a creature or discard a card, it starts killing them very fast. So one thing that I think is really important here is why Inner Ring's Pupil and not something far cheaper that is going to hit the opponent's hand, like Phoenix's Touch, or even Path to Phoenix. So Phoenix's Touch, 1 mana, makes each opponent discard a card and lose 1 life, and then you can sacrifice it to draw a card. Path of Phoenix makes each opponent discard 2 and mill 2, and then each opponent loses 2 life, you gain 2 life, and then if your opponent has 8 or more cards in their graveyard, you can exile a card from that graveyard and cast a card exiled this way this turn. So, you know, in theory, Path of Phoenix and Phoenix's Touch might be better for shredding our opponent's hand than Inner Ring Pupil and the other hand attack card, which we'll get to in a moment. But one of the things that was also on my mind is, you know, if we have 18 creatures, 15 of which are very relevant, you know, enter the battlefield abilities, you know, squeezing in an experimental flight seems really relevant. For starters, flying creatures are something we don't really have many easy ways to deal with besides removing them. So being able to give one of our creatures flying definitely helps shore up that issue. And then also, flicker a Data Weaver, flicker an Inner Rings Pupil, flicker even just a lurking Vircolacus that hasn't gotten to grow too much or is under fire from removal, flicker a Protoclast Behemoth, shoot another thing. Especially if our opponent's casting a spell to remove Protoclast Behemoth, they pay the ward cost, then we Experimental Flight, flicker it out of play, exile another one of our opponent's creatures. That can be utterly backbreaking, especially when we're ending that whole sequence with a 9/6 trample flyer with that same brutal ward cost. And with that in mind, rather than going for one of the enchantments that can't necessarily, get repeated off of Experimental Flight, we've gone for Harvesting Blade as our other way of attacking our opponent's hand. This does two relevant things here. First off, it is an artifact with an Enters trigger, so it is going to be relevant for Experimental Flight. We can flicker it with Experimental Flight. We can draw step, make our opponent discard exile 2 cards from their hand before they get to go to their main phase and cast stuff, thanks to Experimental Flight. But on top of that, one of the other things that Harvesting Blade does relevantly that Path of Phoenix and Phoenix's Touch, did I? Phoenix's Touch. Yeah, Phoenix's Touch. One of the relevant things that these two cards can't do is make our opponent exile the cards that they're losing from their hand. Harvesting Blade does make them exile. So not only does Harvesting Blade play into that attrition game, play into sort of shredding what our opponent has available to them, but also can help fuel our Protoclast Behemoth, which is pretty nice. On top of all of that, we also have other cards that are capable of making our opponent exile as well, that also provides them additional value when needed. Our other instant we have on hand is Stolen Secrets. 2 mana going to make our opponent exile the top 4 cards of their library, and we can play 2 of those cards until the end of our next turn, spending mana of any type to cast them. This is nice because this will let us hit our land drops, something that Data Weaver and Callisto can also do. We can play lands that we hit from our opponent, so we can sort of get more mana, get deeper into our opponent's library, get to play lands without having to spend lands from hand, so we can just kind of go deeper into the game, provided the mana that we have on board is already good enough. But the other thing that's really nice with Stolen Secrets is just, it's 2 mana, reduce the cost of our Protoclast Behemoth by 4. 2 mana, draw 2 cards, and that cost less with Callisto in play. There's just some nice value to be had off of Stolen Secrets. If our opponent is an aggressive deck, we can take two 1-drops or 2-drops off of our opponent and then play them the following turn after Stolen Secrets, so we can kind of respond to our opponent's aggression. Against controlling decks, obviously we can take a relevant piece of interaction from our opponent and play it against them the following turn, or we can take a counter spell and then play one of our spells backed up by our opponent's counter spell. A lot of little good things that happen here with Stolen Secrets. The only downside with Stolen Secrets is that every card we play off of Secrets, which is also true of Data Weaver and Callisto, any cards we play with these effects does increase the cost of our Protoclast Behemoth. That is a tension we're going to have to juggle in this league. But I think that tension is worthwhile to juggle in the first place, and I'm curious to see how much that really does end up making Protoclast Behemoth worse. But I'm optimistic. So we're going to try Stolen Secrets. We're going to try this theft package alongside the Behemoth. On top of that, we do have more cards that exile what our opponent has going. We have Chronicle of Extinction. Card continues to be an absolute house in the format. It just had some of its modes rearranged, so it's a little clearer how it works when flashed back. Obviously, we can make our opponent discard 2 cards and exile their graveyard. That is nearly guaranteed to discount our Protoclast Behemoth almost all of the way, especially if we're sort of deep into the game. But this is also just sort of a relevant sweeper. Unfortunately, does kill a good chunk of the things that we have. Inner Rings Pupil will die to it. Data Weaver will die to it. Lurking Vircolacus may die to it for the -3/-3. But one of the things that is nice is we have Harvesting Blade. If we can get the blade on one of those creatures, then the extra point of toughness from Harvesting Blade may help it survive the Chronicle of Extinction. Not sure how likely that is to come up, but it is relevant. And of course, we can also Edict our opponent, making them sacrifice a creature and a Planeswalker. Finally, We have 2 copies of Solis Syndicate Pariah. This is a card I was really excited for when Cyberos was first revealed. This card used to originally have its second loyalty ability cost -3 loyalty counters, and I was very, very excited for how powerful Solis could be as just 4 mana, 4 loyalty, uh, go down to 1 loyalty, shred half of our opponent's hand, while also being able to uptick and have us draw cards at the cost of a bit of life. Uh, Something that is nice here is sort of twofold. If our opponent has an even number of cards in hand at our end step, we can drain our opponent for 3 to start to pad our life total a little bit against more aggressive decks. 0 is an even number, so if we've shredded our opponent's hand, Solis is going to help heal us back up a little bit. And just playing Solis against a slower opponent, uh, like shredding half of their hand, if they have like 6 cards in hand, they may have to exile like 3 cards from their hand to avoid having us exchange their hand with the exiled cards, which gets pretty brutal. So I'm really optimistic about Solis. There was a temptation to play Glauna in this slot. I did a bit of gold fishing with Glauna in this slot, played it against the red-white enchantment aggro deck that we played against in round 4 of the GP, and I felt like Glauna wasn't quite holding up to what I needed it to for this deck. There's just not really that many ways for this deck to trigger Indulgence to be able to get multiple shots out of Glauna. There's really only Lurking Virkolakis. We're not drawing cards, so Solis is our only way of drawing cards from our own deck, and I'm optimistic about Solis. I'm really, really hopeful that the 2 of Solis will prove to be very potent. And then as for the mana base, I kind of waffled on my land choice for a little bit. We are rocking 7 swamps, 4 islands, 4 flooded morass, and 4 redeveloped cityscape. Pretty clean baseline mana base for the 19 lands. And then the other 4 to get us to 23, we have the one of Mirrormeld Spire. It's a little awkward because it can only really cast the Protoclast Behemoth. We'll see how much this comes up and how often this bites us. I am like hesitant to say that this might want to not be in the deck, but I figure, we're just trying to experiment with things right now. We're just trying to feel how the deck plays and what this deck does and doesn't want. So 1 Spire is worth trying out. And then we're also running 2 Coalesced Glacier and 1 Coalesced Core. The reason for the greater quantity of Glaciers over Cores, despite the fact that we have more black cards over blue cards, is twofold. First off, we do have more black cards than blue cards, but some of our biggest early plays are going to be blue. All of our blue cards come earlier on in the curve, and our black cards come sort of deeper into the curve, with the exception of Lurking Virkolakis and I guess Harvesting Blade Data Weaver. But even then, like, we shouldn't be too hard of a time getting a black source, so I really wanted to make sure that we had enough blue sources without having to, run too many, because we have the Protoclast Behemoth, and that's very non-blue. And I also wanted our blue sources to be capable of casting the Protoclast Behemoth. Coalesced Glacier can absolutely cast the Protoclast Behemoth, which is pretty nice. And then the 1 Coalesced Core is largely just there on the off chance we wind up with a Glacier or Mirrormeld Spire in play, so these still can produce black mana for our other relevant spells. Though I think there may wind up being a case where we just kind of regret having these lands in the deck. I do want to make sure that this isn't just a terrible idea rather than just assuming it's a terrible idea. So a little bit of an adventurous side here. As for our sideboard, we have only instants and sorceries. Very much wanted to keep it as a very interactive sideboard. I thought about, doing something sort of like a transformative sideboard, like take out the Tide's Ires, take out the Protoclast Behemoths, and just like jam in more grindy like interaction. But the more I looked at it, the more I realized that I think what I really want to do is have stuff that both relevantly plays along with our deck and also can help deal with the things that we have to worry about. So starting off, we have Beauclair's Scorn, going to be able to counter non-creature spells against any sort of slower deck, search our opponent's graveyard hand and library for any number of cards with the same name, and exile them. So if there is a particular spell we really don't want to have to deal with, Beauclair's Scorn can get rid of it, and notably, it exiles all of the spells of that name, all of the cards with that name, so that is going to be usually 3 to 4 copies of a card in exile for Protoclast Behemoth. Similarly is Forget Their Names. which will allow us to further, pick apart what our opponent has going on, and then we can also gain a bit of life, pad our life total in that way. Um, I like Forget Their Names over something like Soul Guide Lantern in my like early playtesting with like the Grixis Behemoth list, where you were trying to Garen into the Behemoth with Chittering Gargantua. I was looking at some of the like aggressive self mill package and the aggressive opponent mill package alongside a Soul Guide Lantern. But the more I kind of looked at this deck, I realized Soul Guide Lantern doesn't necessarily do a whole lot besides making our Lurking Virkolakis worse. So I'd much rather, Forget Their Names, our opponents, like redeveloped Cityscape from hand, and then potentially get to pick a second Cityscape out of their hand, or like Cityscape from their graveyard, potentially pick a second Cityscape out from their hand, or if we start to get deeper in the game, we're able to answer one of our opponent's problematic permanents, and then we can Forget Their Names future copies of that permanent. We'll see how good Forget Their Names is, but this is another card I think is really going to be experimental in this list. We also have Dissect Intel as more interaction, a bit of a hand attack. This is just going to integrate a card from our opponent's hand. Dissect Intel ended up being the choice over Agonizing Remorse, which it ended up being a bit of a close call. I think two big factors here. First off, as much as I'd love to hit the graveyard, I don't really want to be losing life here, especially with some coalesced lands in the mana base, and with Selice in the spell suite. I don't really want to be hurting myself a whole lot. So that was a reason to be off of Agonizing Remorse. And then the other reason to be on Dissect Intel is just that it integrates the card, which means that if we hit any Data Weavers, those will allow us to play the card that we got out of our opponent's hand, which is nice. Finally, we do have a bit more board interaction. We have 2 copies of Suppressive Fire, just a small little removal spell that we can board in against aggressive decks. Exiles the creature that it kills. There are better removal spells than Suppressive Fire for sure, but this really is something that we're kind of just making a concession to make sure that our deck can really consistently get Protoclast Behemoth fueled. And so, Suppressive Fire might not be the best inclusion in the world, but I think it will have opportunities where the exiling of the creature is relevant for Protoclast Behemoth. And notably, it is 3/3 is a relevant breakpoint for a lot of creatures in the format right now. This kills any Rough Rider. This kills pretty much any creature out of the Extraction Mission decks, because I don't think Extraction Mission is dead by any means. This kills like nearly every creature out of the white-red enchantments aggro deck, barring any sort of like protection or massive buff. So Suppressive Fire is really nice in that respect. So I'm optimistic about Suppressive Fire. It's not super splashy and it's not super pretty, but I do think it could end up doing a lot for us. We also have 3 copies of Cull Populace, going to be very much for those wider aggressive decks. Not something we can really board in against tokens, unfortunately, but this is going to be a nice way to, shred what our opponent has on board. And of course, if our opponent has like 3 creatures they're losing to Cull Populace, that is reducing our Protoclast Behemoth by 3. And those are all creatures that we can like sort of integrate onto our lands and then play off of a Data Weaver later on. Then finally, we have our 4th copy of Chronicle of Extinction. I thought about trying to squeeze Field Test into the deck in some capacity. Perhaps Field Test would have been nice. Having a bit more control over the size of our sweeper is nice, but I really did want to go for mana efficiency, and ultimately one of the things that is true of Field Test is that it is just so costly. So I'm trying to make sure that we don't have to worry about having a bunch of mana and nothing to spend it on. That's what the Callisto's for. That's what Data Weaver's for. That's what Stolen Secrets and Selice are for. We have a lot of ways to sort of keep the mana that we have used. This is sort of very much a like tap out control deck. And so with that in mind, I don't really want to be going up on Field Test as It could be very good. Field Test could absolutely be very good, and I do want to acknowledge that because I'm sure people will want to say to me like, where is Field Test? This card is good. And I think again, it really does come down to I don't want to be spending 5+ mana on this spell in this deck. I want to be trying to spend like 4 mana on 3 to 4 mana on a lot of my spells and a lot of my interaction, so that way I have more mana to do other things with in the late game. So unfortunately, Field Test kind of not quite making the cut. But again, we do have that 4th Chronicle of Extinction in matchups where we feel we need it. Something we can board in against tokens. So that is the breakdown of blue-black Ire Theft. I'm nervous to see how Tide's Ire plays, but with Data Weaver and Callisto and Stolen Secrets being able to steal creature cards for us to play, which gives us more things to play into our Tide's Ire, with the like basic mana values of our cards being enough that we can like just sort of cast a Data Weaver, a Callisto, and an Inner Rings Pupil and make an 8/8 Kraken for our trouble. I'm curious to see how Tide's Ire ends up playing. So I'll see you in games.